Welcome to part 5 in our series, What Happens When God Shows Up? I've been so excited for this night because I've hardly been able to wait to tell you about what God did in the Outer Hebrides Islands off the northwest coast of Scotland between 1949 and 1952. It is like God wove together a tapestry of people and personalities that He could make a beautiful, beautiful work of art. And so tonight I want to introduce you to the key people that God used to create a very special revival. The first two people I want you to meet are elderly. Their names are Peggy and Christine Smith. Peggy is completely blind, and her sister, Christine, is crippled over with arthritis, and she's 82. Needless to say, when you're blind and crippled, you're pretty much homebound. There wasn't a lot of places that Christine and Peggy could go. They pretty much stayed in their little, simple, humble cottage, wondering, why in the world are we still alive? I mean, literally, all they wanted to do was go home to heaven. They were in such tough shape that heaven looked pretty good. But here they found themselves waking up morning after morning, wondering, why are we still here? Well, they began to pray about it and said, God, you clearly do not want us in heaven yet. So what are we supposed to do down here? Our lives feel worthless. I mean, we just feel useless. What do you want us to do? And as they talked about it and prayed about it, they thought, you know what? About all we're good for is prayer. So we might as well get serious about praying. And so those two simple elderly women, 84 and 82, began to pray with a passion that they had not had in their whole lives. They prayed for their church. They prayed for their pastor. They prayed for the young people in their little village of Barvis. They prayed up and down the roads, praying for every household, the people in there by name. Barvis was a little town under 1,000 people, so they could cover them all. Many, many nights, Peggy and Christine couldn't sleep, as many elderly people will tell you. And so they would get up and pray many times from 10 at night until 2 in the morning. After doing this for several months, kind of reached a point where Peggy felt that God would begin to give her dreams, and she would see a revival happening. She'd see hundreds of young people pouring into their church. And so she contacted her pastor, Pastor James McKay, and she said, Pastor, you better call the deacons and the elders together because we're about to see a revival. God has shown me that a revival is coming to the Outer Hebrides Islands, to this region of Lewis. So the pastor took it pretty seriously because he had a lot of respect for these two old ladies. So he summoned the elders and the deacons, and they began to meet and to pray 2 nights a week for several hours. While this is going on, all of this is being woven together by the Holy Spirit. There were 7 farmers. They had gone to their denomination's annual meeting, and at the annual meeting there was report after report about pretty much the pathetic state of Christianity in Scotland and in the Hebrides Islands. Report after report said attendance was low. Most of the churches were just older people. Many of the churches had no youth. So these 7 farmers came home and they said, you know what? We need to do something radical. And so they decided they were going to meet and pray together 3 nights a week. And so they would tuck their families in, tuck their wives in bed and their kids, and then they would go to a haymow in a barn and go up in the loft, and then they would spend hours and hours at night crying out to God to change their village, change their church, change the Hebrides Islands, change Scotland. And they met night after night, 3 nights a week, till sometimes 4 or 5 in the morning when they just leave from the barn and go to work. Well, after doing this for 5 months, one of the farmers said, Isn't this just a bunch of humbug that we would be meeting night after night, week after week? What have we seen for all our prayer? Like, where's the results? They literally had seen no difference. And so one of the farmers said, you know, I wonder if the problem is that we ourselves are not right with God. And he quoted from Psalms 24, where it says, who may ascend the hill of the Lord? Who may dwell in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, he may ascend the hill of the Lord. And the farmer said, you know, you guys, do we have clean hands and a pure heart? Are we right with God? And he got down on his knees and started to pray, God, have mercy on us. Show us where we have been responsible for holding back your hand of revival and your spirit from moving. Search us, O God, know our hearts. Try us and know our thoughts. See if there's any wicked way in us and lead us in the way everlasting. That night, all 7 of those farmers were on their knees or laying prostrate on the haymow floor, crying out to God and repenting and confessing their sins to each other. Okay, hold tight now, stay with me. While this is going on, there is another prayer meeting happening. So keep in touch now. Peggy and Christine Smith are praying. The deacons and elders at the Barvis Free Church are praying. The farmers are praying. And the 4th group is praying is in a cottage. The cottage is full. People are praying. It's the middle of the night. There was a guy there that was referred to in the town as Blacksmith John. And so as they were closing in prayer about midnight, Blacksmith John was asked to close in prayer. He stands up and he says, God, you promised to pour out water on thirsty land. You promised that you would bless our offspring and our descendants. God, it just ain't happening here. God, if I know anything about myself, I know I'm an empty vessel, thirsty for you and desperate for your miraculous power. God, your honor is at stake, God. I challenge you to fulfill your covenant agreement with us and pour out your spirit on our land. And you know what happened? The cottage began to shake. The dishes in the cupboards were rattling. People went down on their faces. It was like the book of Acts when the Holy Spirit fell. That's the night that all this cumulative amounts of prayer like reached heaven, and God just must have said, it's enough, and he poured out his spirit on Barvis. So when people were leaving from their various places, the haymow, the pastors, the ladies, they saw in the middle of the night, this is sleeping time, lights are going on, flicking on in every cottage in Barvis. As they're going home, they were finding people out in the road, crying out to God for mercy. People had come out of their homes. People were laying in the road ditches. God, have mercy on me. God, have mercy. It was just a huge, huge outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Then a guy came from Scotland whose name was Duncan Campbell. He came after the revival had already kicked in. He basically was considered the pastor, the shepherd of the revival. He would have 4 services a night. One would start at like 9 o'clock, one at midnight, one at 3 o'clock, one at 5, and then it would go on again the next night. Some people were in church all night long. Many people only needed 2-3 hours of sleep and then they would go back to work. Duncan Campbell went all over the region preaching and making sure that the people were being discipled and grounded in their faith. One time, Duncan describes that he went to a home to visit and he asked, "Hey, where's your son, Donald? I'd like to meet with him." And they said, "Oh, he's out in the barn doing chores." And so Duncan went out to the barn and he found Donald kneeling by a bale of hay with his Bible open in front of him and praying. And Duncan said, "Excuse me, Donald." And Donald turned and glanced back at him and he said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm having a meeting with my king and I just can't talk to you right now." Donald was only 15 years old, and here was a teenager crying out to God for revival as well. So God was using all ages, from 84 to 15, old people, young people, regular, just working Joes. God was using everybody as he poured out his Spirit on what Blacksmith John said was thirsty ground. So what happened? What were some more of the results? The story is told one day that a school bus driver so convinced that everyone needed to be saved, that as he's driving the bus to school, he stops the bus. He turns around and says to the students, "I want to know if you're all right with Jesus. Have every one of you done business with God? Because there's nothing more important than knowing that you're right with Jesus and that you're saved." Another lady was out in the barn milking the cows when the Holy Spirit just spoke to her about the spiritual condition of her neighbor. So she just set the bucket down, got up, and went to her neighbor's place to share with her neighbor that she needed to be born again. And that morning, the neighbor accepted Jesus. So there were so many stories. I could talk all night, but we don't have that kind of time. I just want to share one other interesting thing that you might not know. And I want to preface this by saying, I'm not intending for this to be political in any way. Those two sisters, Peggy and Christine, had a niece named Mary Ann McLeod. She immigrated to the United States when she was 18 years old and settled in New York City, first in Long Island and then in Manhattan. She married a guy named Fred, and they had a child, I think he was number 4 or number 5, named Donald Trump. Yes, that's right. The 45th President of the United States. His aunties are Peggy and Christine Smith. And he is named after Donald, which is Mary Ann McLeod's cousin. Donald is named after him. So this whole revival that took place in the Hebrides has a lot of interesting factors to it. So let's all ask ourselves some questions. To you that are elderly, I know my mom is one of those. She's 88 years old and is in Shady Knoll in Grantsburg. Many of you elderly have been shut in during this time of COVID, and you may have felt, my life is useless. I think Peggy and Christine tell you that it isn't. Maybe you're common, hardworking people. You guys get up every day and go to a blue-collar job. But it was 7 men, 7 farmers, that prayed in a haymow 3 nights a week because they wanted their church and their community to change. Maybe you're a teenager and you think, wow, our school is so wild. There's so much stuff going on. If my parents only knew. Take a lesson from Donald. Find a quiet place. Spend some time with your king. God can use teenagers to change a nation. So I just wanted to share this story with you and say again, this is what happens when God shows up.